being debt-free was super important, but we had the runway to accomplish that. When I talk to people who don't have the runway to accomplish that, then you need to be a little bit more strategic because, as you said, cash is king when you're in this transition period. And if you spend all of your cash to pay down your debt, yes, that can be a positive thing, but you've limited your flexibility.
Welcome to the Military Money Manual Podcast, where every episode is all about achieving financial independence in the military faster than before. We believe personal finance shouldn't be boring or intimidating. Building wealth can be simple, and financial freedom is the ultimate financial goal. Now, here's your hosts, Spencer and Jamie.
Kate, we've talked about, Jamie and I on the podcast before, about not buying a house on active duty, but you had an article up on your website, khorrell.com. It's been up there for a while too. I think 2021 I saw was the date. And you say, don't buy a house when leaving the military. Hot take. What do you think? Is it still relevant 4 years later?
It is still relevant 4 years later. Just like everything in this world, right? There's very little that's black and white. Everything is some shade of gray. But for most people, that shade of gray should be telling them, hey, hang on a hot minute. It's a very volatile time in life, as you know, Spencer. There's a lot of moving parts. And the statistics show that more than half of veterans leave their first job within 2 years of leaving the military, whether they're retiring or separating. Sometimes people are on job 4 at the 2-year mark.
Wow.
Tied into a mortgage, that limits your options incredibly. It's also really stressful.
I think that's important for people to understand that sometimes we get the notion of, I finally have control over my life, so I'm going to take control. I'm going to plant down these roots, not understanding some of the realities and the statistics behind it, that you've never had the freedom to choose an employer or choose what type of job or choose how far from your work you want to do, or maybe even choose which school district you live in some cases, if you're restricted to on base or close to post. So there's a lot at once and it can be really overwhelming. So maybe questioning the mindset of, this is my chance to now finally be an adult and take control and do the American thing and buy a house.
I mean, I think overall Americans have a misconception about the value of buying a house if you're not going to live there for 30 years to begin with. And that's true for everybody, not just the military. But when you add the impact of either while on active duty moving or while you're leaving the service, the other things that are happening in your life, it makes even less sense. And that doesn't change the statistics that if you buy a house and you live in it in 30 years, that's going to make financial sense for you. But that's not the reality for most people.
Yeah, I think I see this all the time online where people are like, I want to buy a house and start building equity. There's this misconceived notion that like house equity is any different than stock equity or bond equity or just a high yield savings account with cash in it, right? Like money is money is money. So whether you're building savings, building net worth in more liquid assets or more illiquid assets like a house, it's still building net worth. Like there's nothing magical about, in fact, the house equity is actually one of the worst assets to hold because it's quite difficult to access that value. So whereas if you had $100,000 saved in, let's say, a S&P 500 index fund, you could sell that and have the cash tomorrow. But if you had a house with $100,000 of equity, yeah, you can get home equity line of credits and you could do, you can remortgage and refinance. There's ways to access that cash, but it's always with incurring debt. There's always a debt component to it. And even when the home is paid off, sure, you have that asset that in your balance sheet, but you can't eat it. Like you can't. And what I mean by that is you can't. Sure, you're not paying rent anymore, so your expenses have gone down, but you still have utilities, you still have homeowners insurance, you still have HOAs, you have all these expenses, and you're in a fixed location. And if you want to move, you need to get rid of this asset, or you need to rent it out. They just get obsessed with the idea of, oh, I need to buy a house. I need to buy a house. And they don't think about the end game. They don't think about, okay, but what happens when we're not here in a couple of years? And for transitioning service members, I mean, in my personal case, I went from essentially being unemployed for 9 months to being employed for 6 months to being unemployed again. And that was in 2 different countries. And actually, I did try to buy a house. Thankfully, it fell through. But if I had bought that house, man, that would have been such a stressful even more stressful time of my life. The flexibility of renting, people, they try to, a lot of time optimizers like Jamie and I are financial optimizers, like, right? And I think you are too, Kate, right? We love our spreadsheets. We love the math. But at the end of the day, you have to put a value on stress and health and mental bandwidth. And I think renting just gives you so many more options. And people discount. They discount that and they think, no, I need to get into the housing market. I need to start building home equity. And you can build wealth in other ways. And that's not to say eventually you're not going to buy a house. Like, there will be a time in your life when it's right. But maybe a military transition, whether it's separation or retirement, maybe that's not the right time. Maybe just give it a year or two and let yourself get settled and find a place that you want to be longer term.
There are so many reasons I agree with you. Although now I think I want to go get a PhD, and this is going to be my thesis topic. Why people want to buy houses. One of the things you said that I think is really interesting is about where it fits on the balance sheet. And this is one of those places where the math and the emotions don't always line up. And you don't always have to pick the math, but it's important that you acknowledge that you're not picking the math and don't use it to defend the choices that you're making. The house that I live in now, we bought while my husband was on active duty. It made zero financial sense, but it was in the neighborhood we wanted to live in. It had a first floor bedroom and a bathroom, which was really important because his parents were unable to do stairs at that time. It was a place we've lived before, so we had a pretty good idea that we were probably right. But I freely acknowledge that this was not a financially smart decision. This cost us on our balance sheet. Even though on our balance sheet it looks like it made sense, it really doesn't, because we now have a huge portion of our net worth is tied up in this asset that, as you said, it could very easily lose value. Being 45 minutes outside of DC right now, it is expensive to maintain. The taxes are expensive. There's a lot of reasons why this didn't make sense, but we didn't buy it pretending that it made sense financially.
Okay, we talk about the instability of the time of the transition and moving jobs. Can you talk a little bit about how renting might just free up some of that option for you if you did need to switch jobs or you're doing another move, a temporary period of renting, maybe 1 or 2 more years during the transition period?
I think the main thing is if you start your first new job, or maybe like Spencer, you didn't get a job immediately, and then you decide you're going to look for employment, you are geographically restricted. And depending on where you're living, that geographic restriction could be a real impediment to your job search. It also depends on what type of work you're looking for. If you're really just looking for a part-time job to fill in the, hours of the day, chances are you're going to be able to find something in most locations. But if you have a very specific set of skills or you're looking for a certain income level, not every location is going to have those jobs. Or even if they have those jobs, they may not have those jobs available when you're looking for them. Most people I talk to when they leave the military, they go where the job is. And if you have a house that you bought 2 years ago, so you haven't made your money back on it, right? You haven't even caught up to what you paid for it. And you might need to bring money to the table to sell it. That's really going to impact your job search. If you are financially independent and you don't need to work and you don't anticipate that you're going to want to go back to work, then maybe that's one of those gray areas, right?
So you've been through retirement when your spouse retired from the Navy. Can you talk a little bit about the stressfulness of that time? You've been so accustomed to active duty, you know what to expect, you know the benefits, you know the rules, and then it's all new.
We are pretty fortunate that my work situation did not change. And my husband has not pursued 9-to-5 employment since he left the military. And yet it still felt like running in front of an avalanche. I feel like the last 8 weeks were just so overwhelming. For anybody in the audience who had a really big wedding and you were one of the partners that was very involved in planning it, it felt like trying to plan a really big wedding, except it wasn't actually that exciting.
Yeah, it's not fun.
It's not fun. There are so many logistics and so many details. And you're dealing with like the logistical stuff like moving. You're dealing with the financial things like this. There's this huge change to your income. And then you're also dealing with a lot of emotional baggage. Many service members and their spouses don't even realize how much impact this is having on their mental health or their coping skills, all different aspects of this that come into play. And when I teach at transition assistance classes, I say that you have, of those three factors, logistical, emotional, and financial, if you plan early, you have the most control over your finances. You can't really control the emotional. The logistical is going to be hard, even if you are prepared for it. But the financial stuff, the more you can have your ducks in a row, the easier everything is going to be. I mean, we all know that's true, that when we have our financial ducks in a row, life is just less stressful, particularly during transition.
I want to read a line from the article on your website that kind of inspired this podcast topic with you today. Leaving the military is one of the largest transitions that most folks will make in their lives. For civilians, retirement from a job ranks 10th on the list of 100 biggest stressors in life. So for military families, the transition to civilian life is even more complicated than just a retirement or a job change. So you've mentioned things like the change in financial state, change of the new employment, housing situation, change in location, stopping or starting education programs, change to your work friends, all these things that add up to the stress. And you mentioned some of the anecdotal stories and what so thanks for sharing that. But it's pretty clear to me, having not been on it, that if I can eliminate one major stressor from my life, buying a house, pre-qualifying for a mortgage when I don't have a paycheck, all those things, it can free up some of my brain power to handle the mental health piece, the social network rebuild as I move away, and taking care of our family in some other ways than just trying to find that dream home that I've now been picturing and think I can finally realize.
I think the other thing to remember is, particularly the longer you've been in the military, sometimes this concept of dream home has become a little bit mythological. And there's no such thing as a dream home. There's no such thing as a dream college. There's no such thing as a dream job. You can have a great job that is a perfect fit, but not all aspects of it are going to be perfect. And I think that service members and spouses often have this problem when it comes to houses, that this house is going to solve all these problems, that, you know, our marriage is going to be better, and I'm going to take up knitting and other things that are just not realistic.
The knitting was my goal for sure.
Jamie's been talking a lot about knitting with me recently, and I just don't see it though, Jamie, when you separate. If you're not knitting now, you're not going to start knitting when you separate.
He's going to need a hobby.
This is his hobby. Don't distract him, Kate.
Just a quick note from one of our sponsors, and we'll be right back to the show. Don't know an IRA from a TSP or an SCRA from a CZTE? Fear not, the Military Money Manual, A Practical Guide to Financial Freedom, is here to help. In this concise, no-nonsense guide, our very own Spencer Reese, founder of the popular personal finance site, militarymoneymanual.com, offers invaluable tips and tricks to help service members of all ranks, branches, and bank account levels gain financial independence. Along with laying out the fundamentals of building wealth while serving, the book explains how to take maximum advantage of the unique financial perks available only to service members, whether active duty or reserve, officer, or enlisted. These benefits include special tax-deferred savings plans, preferential bank loans, fee waivers on high-end credit cards, and much, much more. Personal finance is not boring or intimidating. With its candid and accessible tone, this book feels like having a beer with a good and financial savvy friend. So pull up a chair, get comfortable, and learn how to make your military money work for you with the Military Money Manual, A Practical Guide to Financial Freedom by Spencer Reese.
The Military Money Manual is available on Amazon, Audible, and my website in hardcover, paperback, ebook, Kindle, and audiobook. Podcast listeners are eligible for a special discount by using promo code PODCAST when they purchase the Military Money Manual on shop.militarymoneymanual.com. Okay, what you said about top 10 stressors in life, I think separation for me was probably a top 3. I mean, for my situation, I left my squadron, I left the military, I left my friends behind, I moved countries, I moved, even just moving house, that's one of the big stressors in life. And I don't think I'm alone in saying that I thought I was ready. I had my financial ducks in a row more than probably 99% of people who separate from the service. And yet within a few months of separating, I want to say lost. I want to say struggling mentally. And it was an extremely difficult transition. And I think I probably was in one of the best positions to go through the transition. So when anybody tells me that they had a difficult transition, all I can say is, yes, I believe you, because it is an incredibly difficult thing for most people to go through and most people to do. And that's without adding the stress of trying to buy a home while you're separating or retiring from the service. So, but one of the things you mentioned there was setting yourself up to be financially ready to separate. And are there any tactical things, like very nitty-gritty things that you recommend service members or military spouses to do as they're approaching separation? I mean, off the top of my head, the one thing I tell people is cash. Just you want to build up cash. And if that means that you stop contributing or you reduce your contributions to your retirement accounts for a little bit, this is the time to do it, because you'll never be more thankful to have $10,000, $20,000 just sitting there ready to deploy for whatever you need for your transition. But is there anything else tactically other than just telling people to have more money?
So the other big thing, obviously, is debt, but that becomes a tricky situation because every person needs to make this plan based upon the specifics of their situation. My husband and I started planning financially for him to get out 15 years before he did, because he served for 30 years and we started planning at 15 years because we thought he might get out at 20. Being debt-free was super important, but we had the runway to accomplish that. When I talk to people who don't have the runway to accomplish that, then you need to be a little bit more strategic, because as you said, cash is king when you're in this transition period. And if you spend all of your cash to pay down your debt, yes, that can be a positive thing, but you've limited your flexibility. So it really depends on how long people have, what their timeline is, and what the constraints of their particular situation are. Obviously, if you are an E4 who has served for 6 years, and you're getting out and you're moving home with mom and dad, you've got different requirements, but you also have different levers that you can pull. When my husband got out, we had a several $1,000s a month mortgage and 4 kids in college. Had we not started preparing so ridiculously early, we wouldn't have had a lot of wiggle room to play with. And so our choices would have been different than someone who's got more wiggle room for whatever reason.
I just keep coming back to the stress that I can hear in both of your stories as the one of the three of us that's on the other side of it that you guys are both on now. And another thing in your article, you talk about the impact of stress on our decision-making. Like there's decisions I have to do, survivor benefit program, where we're going to live. There's all kinds of things that are mandatory decisions.
VA disability claim.
Yeah, VA disability, all these things. And so you mentioned that we don't make our best decisions under stress, and knowing that this is a stressful time, and the benefit of eliminating one of those major decisions, we don't have to lock up $500,000, $700,000 in a house right now. Let's just go try out a neighborhood for 6 months or a year and see how it goes.
I think people really like to speed run things, right? They're like, oh my gosh, I'm getting out, so I got to buy a house and I got to start setting up the life that I want to create. And if someone says, whoa, just pump the brakes and rent for a year in the neighborhood to make sure that this is the neighborhood that you want to be in, this is the school district you want to be in. And people are like, no, I've been doing that for 20 years of active duty. I've been moving all over the world. I want to settle down. I want to create a life for my family. And it's like, yes, you will. I promise you. But if you make a snap decision right now, it limits your options. And that's not always a bad thing, right? Like there is that idea of like option fatigue and the idea that we're unhappy when we have too many choices to make. Like when people are presented with grape or raspberry jelly, they're happy to make a choice. But when they're presented with 30 different options of jellies, then all of a sudden their happiness decreases because the choice is overwhelming. So there is something to be said for limiting your options, but I don't think there's something to be said for locking yourself into especially in this high interest rate environment, locking yourself into an expensive purchase that comes with a large monthly repayment and is difficult to get yourself out of. I think that's the real sticking point for me, is that when you go through with this decision, it's not something that you can reverse very quickly, unlike a renting situation where it's, give your landlord 30 days notice, pay an extra month's rent, and then you're out.
You bring up an excellent point. So I think you really hit on an important thing there, Jamie, that the decision making and what you end up buying, and this can go all different directions. You could end up overspending. I bought a car one time when I had 3 toddlers and I was pregnant and my husband was deployed. And I did not make the best decision for our family when I purchased this car. And I completely defend that because my defenses were down. I did not have a car big enough for a 4th car seat. There was a lot of pressure on me to make this car purchase. And so this car was, I don't know, it was a few years back, $30,000. But when you apply that same type of fatigue, as you say, to a house, the consequences just can be so much bigger. And there are no costs to buying and selling a car, right? If we wanted to turn around and sell it, sure, we were going to get hit with depreciation, but it wasn't going to cost me 11% of the value of the car to unload it. And it might not take me 4 months to unload it. And I think most people who are listening to this have probably seen people who have speed bought a house on active duty. Like we all know somebody who bought a house on active duty and they bought it because they were rolling into town and they didn't want to rent. And sometimes those decisions turn out great, but sometimes they move in and they realize that maybe there was damage that they didn't know about, or that the school district was getting ready to be rezoned, but they didn't know because they weren't from there. So many reasons why this is not a time that you want to be doing things, not impulsively, but really in a hurry.
Yeah. I think another point that you make, Kate, is that your life after active duty, whether that's separation or retirement, there's just so many unknowns in terms of lifestyle, in terms of how much you're going to be spending every month, in terms of, you might be also in a transition with your family, right? Like you might have kids who are going off to college or graduating college and going off into the world, or boomeranging and coming back home. You might be getting into that sandwich generation where you're looking after kids and you're looking after your parents. And all of a sudden the house that was your dream house is looking a little small because you're like, oh, we need an in-law apartment, and because we're gonna be looking after my mother or her mother. That changes the equation. And that could be something that you weren't even anticipating and has just become apparent within maybe a year of separating. And all of a sudden the house that you bought on that speed buying purchase, you're like, it's not appropriate for our situation anymore. And you could say, okay, that could happen in any scenario, but it is interesting that the military, usually takes in people in that 18 to 22-year-old range, and you're getting out in that 40 to 42-year-old range. And those can be very transitional times in your life where the responsibilities are increasing and you just might be responsible for more than you were even just a year or two ago.
That's very true. And I think the other thing we can't accurately predict when we leave the military is what the rest of the financial picture is going to look like. And, Spencer, you and I are analysts at heart, and there are spreadsheets involved. And I still, how many years are we now? 4 years later, I'm trying to figure out how my predictions were so inaccurate. I do not know what I got so wrong. And it wasn't so wrong that we can't eat, but it is not, the math is just not where I thought it was going to be. And I was talking to a fellow personal finance geek who is getting ready to leave the Army. And he said, I don't have a lot of confidence in my financial plan. There's too many unknowns. And I said, well, the fact that you recognize that there's too many unknowns is probably the most important part of this equation, because this is going to be a perfect example of no plan survives initial contact. And for those of you who've not heard that phrase before, that's like a real thing. And it's incredibly true in the financial aspect of getting out of the military. As Spencer said, right, you don't know if you're going to take on new responsibilities, or if because your kids are in that age, their situation is going to start requiring a whole bunch of financial input in a way that you didn't plan for. Sometimes one of the things I did not adequately account for in our plan was that a couple years after getting out, we were going to have kids moving from TRICARE to TRICARE Young Adult, which is very, very good coverage and still cheaper than what they can get somewhere else, but is not free like it is when they're on regular TRICARE. At one point, we had 3 kids on TRICARE Young Adult. We were paying almost $1,000 a month in TRICARE Young Adult fees. And I did not adequately put that in our financial plan. Because it seems like, oh, that's only 3 years per kid. But if you start multiplying that by multiple kids, or if they overlap, that's a lot of money.
I'm just so excited to separate or retire in a few years. You guys are just really encouraging me right now. This is going to be good. No,
It's going to be awesome.
I just love the idea here of buying a house. And this is another quote from your article. Buying a house is typically the largest purchase anyone will make in their life. Buying a house when your budget is built on guesses is a bad idea. So I'm thinking, I don't know exactly what my VA loan is going to be. Like most people may not know exactly the dollar amount that they might be, not VA loan, a VA disability. I mean, the dollar amount that you're getting in. You don't know what state taxes are like. Some of you have never paid state taxes in your life before, and now all of a sudden you're going to be subject to state taxes. You and your spouse, potentially both, for the first time in your adult life. I don't know what the new private school actual costs are. We just registered my son for a public school, $75 registration fee for a public school. Like, never seen that before. That's new for the new place we're PCSing to this summer. And so I just picture all these things that are going to sneak up on you. And I think there's a really powerful caution there of you don't really know what it's going to be like when you transition, and it's built on guesses. So hopefully it's a little bit freeing too for people that are overwhelmed.
I think that's the biggest thing, Jamie, is that like if someone is like feels anxious about this decision, I just want to like give them a hug and be like, don't, like, take a chill pill. It's okay to rent. There's this pressure, especially for the optimizers, right? Especially for the people who feel driven to get ahead and to grow their net worth and to become debt free and to give their kids a better life than what they had. There's this pressure internally or externally to achieve and to grow and to do the right thing, quote unquote. So many people think that's buying a house, and it's like in the right time and place. I just want to tell them. And maybe if you feel overwhelmed right now, buying a house is not going to help with that feeling. That's the critical piece that I would like to tell someone is go where you want to go, take the job that you want to take, rent the beautiful condo, the beautiful single family home that you want to rent in the neighborhood that you want to be in, and then start the process of house hunting and take your time, slow down. I think the other thing too is with the overheated housing market we've had for the last couple of years, people are like, oh my gosh, if I wait 2 or 3 years, housing prices are going to double again. No, they're not. And if they do, then they're going to come crashing down very soon afterwards because it's unsustainable, right? Assets, especially real assets, don't go up that fast over the long term. They have to essentially, I mean, if you look at single family housing, it's barely beaten inflation over the last 100 years. It wasn't until the 1980s that we see this very rapid growth in housing prices. And usually that rapid growth in housing prices is concentrated in the high cost of living or very high cost of living areas, which for a lot of people is not where they live after they leave the service. They move to lower cost of living areas. I mean, you just look at the entire American Midwest, and there are some fantastic buying opportunities, even in Texas, even less than an hour outside of the major cities in Texas, you can have some fantastic buying opportunities where you can be in a good neighborhood with a good house built recently and in a good school district. And those opportunities are there, but you need to slow down and you need to assess what you want your life to look like after the service. And you're not going to know what that is until you start doing it. You can do all the planning in the world. You know, Doug Nordman, our good mutual friend, likes to talk about the fog of work. And it's so true. Like when you're doing it, when you're active duty, you cannot process what your life is going to look like after active duty. And you have to give yourself the time and space to get there, start understanding and start gathering the data and seeing like, okay, I'm working this 9-to-5 job. Is this where I want to be? Yes or no? Is this where we want to live? Yes or no? Are my kids happy? Is my spouse happy? Have I created the life that I want, or have I created the life that I think other people want me to have? And then making sure that change the variables that are within your control to build the life that you want. That's why hopefully that's why you're listening to this podcast, right? Is because you're building wealth to build the life that you want.
So I think you raise an interesting point, and perhaps we can help somebody. Maybe this is our new mission. As you discussed for the optimizers, the math looks really compelling. If I buy this house and I pay my mortgage payment for 30 years, then I'm going to have this benefit in the long run. But what most people don't genuinely conceptualize is how very, very, very little benefit comes at the front end. The benefit of home ownership is not equally distributed across a 30-year mortgage. The first 5 years, most typically, are just a wash. So delaying those first 5 years by a year or two is not going to have a substantial movement of the needle in the big picture. The real benefit comes in years 20, 24, 28. That's when you're still paying that consistent mortgage, but your income is increased because of inflation and cost of living adjustments, especially if you have military retirement pay. And you've paid off so much interest that so much more of your payment is going to the principal anyway. But those first years, they don't have that financial benefit in the same way. And that's something that even people who know that it's true conceptually don't conceptualize the magnitude of how true it is.
I mean, the biggest thing that I'm showing people right now is, and this is especially relevant because interest rates are so high, is if you look at the amortization of mortgages, you are paying interest. So you are not paying down the principal. You are paying you are borrowing money from the bank, and you are paying the bank for access to that money. And if you look at how much of your payment for those first for right now with interest rates, I think it's until 15 or 17 years, you are paying more in interest than you are in principal. And in fact, in the first 5 or 7 years, it's like 80 or 90% of your payment is just interest, is just paying for the service to the bank for allowing you to access their capital, right? Allow you to access their money. And sometimes that is that wake-up call to people when they realize, like, I'm actually not building any equity, right? Like, I'm going to get to the end of the 7-year period and I'm going to go to sell my house, and maybe the capital value, right, of the house has gone up, and so you'll be able to take that difference. But don't forget all of the money that essentially the rent that you have paid to the bank for access to the money to buy the house. And people, again, people equate home equity with this as this like magical money machine. It's just dollars and cents. It's the same thing. If you did the same thing in the stock market, in fact, it's better that way because it's more liquid. You can access it more easily, and you can borrow against it too with pledge asset lines and margin loans. I really want to take people who think that buying a home is this magical wealth creation machine, and it's not any different than any other asset. And in fact, it has a lot of drawbacks, and it does have a lot of positives too, because you get to live in it, right? You can't live in your stocks, but you can live in the house you bought. But like you said, Kate, it's the long term. It's the people who buy the house and live in it for 30 years. If you bought a house 20 years ago, your payments are $1,600 a month, and you're still making those payments 20 or 30 years later. And even just your military retirement or your VA disability will have gone up so much through the cost of living adjustments that your mortgage will just be a rounding error in your budget. So that's where you get the benefit, but you have to live in the home for decades. And that's where you'll start to reap the benefit, unless we're talking about investment property, but that's a completely different topic. And we can have Rich Carey on the podcast again to talk about that, especially if they're a spreadsheet person. Then, let's get out the spreadsheet and let's look, like, at what point are you actually starting to get ahead here? It's not the first 3 years. It's not the first 5 years. It's probably not even the first 7 years. It's probably after 10 years that you're actually starting to get ahead and build the wealth inside the home. And for active duty, it blows my mind that people buy a home when they know they're going to PCS in 2 or 3 years. Unless they have that landlord bug and they have a system, they've read the books, they've read Bigger Pockets. Oh my gosh, you're about to be in for a world of hurt.
I think the other thing that I find with all new homeowners, but sometimes more so with military families, is we all vastly underestimate how much it costs to keep a house running. And we also forget to account for the money we spend that isn't even like maintenance and repairs, but it's like these little improvements. They don't really fall under your balance sheet as like a home improvement, but I can easily go to the hardware store and drop $150 on any given weekend. Like, I don't even have to try.
Yeah. I do that renting.
Yeah. We closed on the house and we didn't move in because my husband was doing workups or something. And I moved us into the house, and he showed up like the day after the moving van. It's 2 days before Christmas. and the main sewer line overflowed that night. And I thought, we could have rented. Like, we didn't have to buy this house. And it was a very stark reminder that owning a home is not a free proposition. And there's no one to call when the dishwasher goes out, or you can't figure out why the outlet that controls your child's nightlight does not have electricity to it, or whatever the case may be, right? It brings us back to that stress and that control thing, that you can't control what houses are going to do, but if it's not your problem, you can control whose stress it is.
I love it, Kate. Well, I think that's a really good summary of a perspective to take. Of course, there's going to be cases where it might make sense for you and your family. All we're asking is for you to pause, acknowledge the stress, the uncertainty, and the unknowns of the transition, and don't feel like you have to fulfill the American dream home kind of thing locked in. Recognize the statistics you mentioned about people, the majority of people moving jobs within their first 2 years, and just take a deep breath and make sure it makes sense for your family before you feel the pressure to just automatically jump into it. Just a quick note from one of our sponsors, and we'll be right back to the show. Hey, Spencer, I've heard about this free Amex Platinum card for military service members. Where can I go to learn more about this?
Great question, Jamie. I've got the Ultimate Military Credit Cards course at militarymoneymanual.com/UMC3. It's a 100% free email-based course, and I explain exactly how to verify your eligibility for credit card annual fee waivers with the Military Lending Act, or MLA, and the Service Member Civil Relief Act, or SCRA. The Ultimate Military Credit Cards course is a beginner's guide to travel hacking and opening up your first annual fee-waived credit card while you or your spouse serves in the U.S. military. There's no spam, no fluff, and the only emails you'll get from me are related to military credit cards. You can unsubscribe at any time, and there's zero cost to you to sign up. You can sign up right now for free at militarymoneymanual.com/UMC3. Again, militarymoneymanual.com/uniform Mike Charlie 3.
And now back to the show.
All right, Kate. So we've convinced 80-90% of our audience to not buy a house on active duty or when they separate, at least for the first couple of years until they've settled down a little bit and figured out their life. But let's talk about that person that's like, no, you know what? I got the job at the Boeing plant in Charleston. I'm happy. I know my coworkers. I've lived in the neighborhood before. I've rented for a while. We're in a good school district. I found the house. It's well within my means. I got a VA loan lined up. Do you have any tips for that person? Like, how can they make this the most successful purchase of their life?
That's a great question. Some of the answer to it depends on where they are in the process. People listening to this may not know that buying a house in that last year before you leave the military can be incredibly difficult because the lenders have to prove that they have reason to believe you have income going into the future, not only for themselves, but for the people they report to, right? It's got to be defensible in an audit that your income looks secure. Now, in the example you gave, this individual may be able to get a letter from the Boeing plant saying, hey, we have this job lined up. For the vast majority of people who are leaving the service in the next year, they don't have such a letter. And so any mortgage qualification is going to be based upon military retirement pay because they don't know about VA disability, or it may include other sources of income if their spouse has a job. So they may find themselves in a position that just even getting that loan is really difficult, and it may limit their options. For a lot of people, if they are trying to buy a house simply qualifying with military retirement pay, they're not going to be able to buy that house that they wanted to buy. The other thing is, just like we would counsel people who are determined to buy a house on active duty, maybe think about what's your exit strategy. Yes, we think this is your dream home, but is this a rentable house? Do the numbers make sense for it to be a rental if the Boeing plant didn't work out, or if the Boeing plant closes and decides it's going to move to San Antonio? Can you rent this house out and make it not be a cash drain on your budget? Don't go overboard. And I say this from experience. The house I'm sitting in right now, which was a really great house when we had 4 young adults and pretty frequent visitors from elderly parents, this was the right size house. We have whole parts of the house we don't even heat anymore. And it's only been 4 years. We've owned the house longer than 4 years, but 4 years since retirement. So I would encourage people kind of in general, right? We don't want to be over consumers of things, but it's hard to be critical about what your needs are because, as Spencer said, they change all the time. The other thing is, how can you protect yourself from risks of the market? Can you put down a large down payment to make sure that you're not going to be underwater if you need to sell? Obviously, you can't guarantee that, right? 2008 hurt a lot of people in that regard. For those of you who are a little younger, you may not remember what 2008 looked like, but prices in some markets fell pretty dramatically. And people who had funded their loans at 100%, right? That's the big selling point of a VA loan. You can take out 100%. They found themselves in a world of hurt because there was no way they could sell their properties for the amount of money that they had paid for it and that they owed at that time. Those are the big ones that jump out at my mind.
Yeah. So, I always tell people at least 20% down payment. And then depending on the state the house is in, you might need another 10% of the house value just ready to go in an emergency fund for repairs or maintenance or just all those little expenses that creep up. I think one of the things you mentioned there was just like those little costs that you don't even add to, the budget in your mind. And Ramit Sethi likes to call those phantom costs. And the way that he estimates is he looks at the mortgage, right? The principal, interest, taxes, insurance, and then adds 50% on top of that to get kind of the real number in his head. And, maybe that might be a little bit high depending on where you're at, but in some places it might be a little bit low. It's really one of those things where if you're going into it, you want to go into it with your eyes open and be careful with the VA loan with the 0% down. We had Brian O'Neill from Wind Wealth on the podcast, and he has a great story about, I think he was buying in Vegas in like 2007, 2008, and lost his shirt. He lost over 6 figures. This guy's an optimizer, right? Like he knows money and he runs his own wealth management firm now. And he talks about this mistake he made when he was younger. Good lesson to learn before, hopefully we can learn from the experiences of others. We don't have to keep repeating the same mistakes over and over again, but you still see it. You still see people getting themselves in trouble with the 0% down VA loan, which can be a good deal for the right person in the right time, but just be careful with it. So that's great. Those are great tips, Kate. I wanted to just move on to a couple other things that you have on your website. I love, as a pilot, you have a lot of checklists, and one of them that, I'll just highlight a couple of them. PCS checklist, military retirement checklist, military separation checklist, and then you've got your conflict prepared life binder. Can you talk a little bit about the life binder? Because this is something that I purchased and I think is just a great tool for military families.
You're so sweet to me. So the life binder came out of a life experience that we had a family emergency, and I ended up leaving my kids with a neighbor that I didn't even know. And, I didn't give her, she didn't have any instructions. Fortunately, she was a good person and reasonably competent, and everyone was fine. But I thought we need a better way to gather information that people would need. And then this concept came to me of, like, people call them in case of emergency binders, but that are more designed towards greater life planning, not like you had to unexpectedly leave your kids with a neighbor for 4 hours, but what happens if you are in a car accident or pass away? I looked for a product out there on the market, and nothing really suited our military lifestyle. And so I made my own, and I gathered the wisdom of many thousand military service members and spouses. Like, what stuff do you just not know? Whether it's where the main water cutoff to your house is, or how to log into DFAS, or how would someone know to send a Red Cross message? And if you guys want, I could send that PDF over. We can put it in the show notes. One of my favorite pages in there is a 1-pager that you fill out and you send to your siblings and your parents, so that if they need to send a Red Cross message and the person on the other end of the phone says, what command are they with? They don't go, I don't know what command they're with. So it's downloadable. It's a fillable PDF. It took years to make because I have to over procrastinate everything, but it's been very well received. It is a lot of work. I don't want people to discount that. I don't know if that's been your experience, Spencer. Filling out all of this information is a lot of work, but it pays off when you or someone you love needs to come in and help your child go to bed that night and does not know when they're screaming, da, 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 what da, da, da means. And I was recently even at my sister's house watching her kids, And I wished that she had a binder because I didn't know which direction the trash cans had to go out on the curb. Like, that's so dumb. But, in some places you have to face them towards the curb, and in some places they have to get faced out. And so I had to walk over to our neighbors and see which direction their trash cans were facing because I didn't want to get in trouble with the trash can police. And we are using a part of it for my own grandfather is 103 and he's a Marine. And so we've got information in there about how to contact DFAS when something happens to him, how to get in touch with, Social Security gets the information automatically. But there's information in there about like VA burials and other things that even if you're not a military family now, if you're helping an older person who's a veteran, it can be helpful.
Okay, Kate, we'd be remiss if we didn't mention it, but I'm super stoked about this, even though I don't have a dependent to give the GI Bill to right now. But you've got a book coming out about the GI Bill in a couple of weeks. In fact, when this episode drops, it might be available. KateHorrell.com/book will be a good URL to go pick it up. But tell us about it. Where did this come from? What's the story behind it? And what can people expect in the GI Bill book?
Yeah, so I accidentally became a little bit of an expert in the post 9/11 GI Bill and also all of the other aspects of college funding that come into play when military benefits are part of the equation. And that happened because, as I said, I have had 4 kids in college at the same time. And my husband had generously shared his post 9/11 GI Bill with the kids, but that certainly did not pay to put 4 kids through college. And so I had to utilize my research skills and my analysis skills to figure out, hey, how are we going to use our resources? And then I started helping other people, and I realized not only is the GI Bill vastly misunderstood, and people don't get the benefit that maybe they should because they don't understand the program, but then just philosophically, a lot of people approach college funding from not the most advantageous way. They tend to think of their resources in silos attached to people. So Kid A has $45,000 in their 529 and 18 months of the GI Bill. And Kid B has $30,000 in 18 months of the GI Bill. And there's just so many better ways to do it. And so as I started doing presentations and coming on podcasts, everybody kept saying, where's the book? So there's going to be a book.
And Jimmy, would you like to share about your siloing plans?
Well, by the time this episode with Kate comes out, the Daniel Kopp episode, both of them will be out. But I had exactly that mindset of this is something I'm giving 1/3 to this kid, 1/3 to this kid, 1/3 to this kid, not realizing it's a better mindset is a family benefit that I can massage and move around as needed. So I look forward to reading your book. Is there a date it's coming out? Do you know? Can you say the date yet for when people should look for it?
It should be out April 15th.
Hey, I can't wait. I'll be one of the first in line. Look forward to continuing to push people towards all your excellent resources on your website, the checklist, the payday calendars. You've gotten a couple shout outs recently if you haven't listened in a while. So
it's all really exciting stuff.
How many decades now have you been doing when's the next military payday?
Many, because I used to publish it at military.com before I started KateHorrell.com. And that was the perennial top web page at military.com within my silo, of course. And then it has never failed to be, when I say not even the top page at KateHorrell.com, it's like nothing else even compares.
Wow.
Right.
It's crazy.
It's true. Yeah, that's the power law, internet power law at work. Like 91% of your content gets 90% of your traffic. Oh, that's awesome, Kate. Well, thank you so much for joining us on the show. KateHorrell.com is the best place to check out what you're working on. And like Jamie said, tons of resources on there. And I'll be sure to grab a copy of your book, April 15th, hopefully, 2025. And if you're listening to this in the future, then you can go to KateHorrell.com/book. Social media, are you doing anything on the Facebooks or the Instagrams?
I have a Facebook page, Kate Horrell. It does not get the love and attention it should get. I spend a lot of time on Facebook answering people's questions for them, but I don't spend a lot of time on Facebook generating content.
People can go to your website and they can find all your social stuff there. Yeah, we had you on the show, I think it was almost a year ago, and we'll have to make sure not another year goes by before we have you back. Always lovely to have a chat.
I love being here. You guys are great fun.
Thanks, Kate.
All right. We'll catch you on the next episode.
Thanks so much for tuning in to this episode of the Military Money Manual podcast. If you're enjoying the show, please feel free to rate, subscribe, and leave a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. This helps others find the show, and we really appreciate it. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll catch you in the next episode.
The views and opinions presented here are those of the speakers and do not necessarily represent the views of the DoD or its components. Reference to any commercial products or services does not constitute DoD endorsement of those products or services.